Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, has been found guilty. The international community was taken aback by the court's verdict. Vladimir Zelensky's griping paid off in the end. War crimes warrants have been issued for Vladimir Putin's arrest. Putin was furious to learn of the verdict, which was made public by the testimony of defecting Russian military leaders. The Russian government is challenging the verdict. The world has been taken aback by recent events in the hot war between Russia and Ukraine, which has lasted considerably longer than anyone anticipated. It has come to light that Russia has committed grave war crimes in addition to forcibly entering Ukrainian territory and causing catastrophic harm. Apart from the destruction inherent in conflict, it is well known that Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky has called for Putin to be tried in an international court on multiple occasions. Crimes against Ukraine have been addressed by the International Criminal Court. Zelensky's efforts in this Russian organized operation paid off after Vladimir Putin's recent onslaught on the Dnipro region. The Ukrainian province of Dnipro was the target of a horrific military campaign. Many soldiers were slain in this attack, and it didn't just happen in the conflict zone. This bombardment, which unfortunately affected innocent civilians, resulted in the destruction of many buildings. Zelensky has made a second petition to the International Criminal Court arguing that these attacks constitute war crimes. The court agreed to issue an arrest warrant for Putin this time around because they saw the attack as an act of treason. Former Russian military personnel who deserted were also enlisted by the Ukrainian armed forces. These soldiers, fearing for their lives in the face of such horrific treatment, took refuge in the Ukrainian armed forces. The court heard testimony from both serving soldiers and deserting officers. These troops hope that by going public, they might bring attention to the situation within the Russian army, as well as the atrocities committed against Ukraine. The Russian soldiers' goal is to increase complaints against Putin by showing how harsh things were for those who were forced into the war. The words of a Russian general named Andrei Medvedev caused a stir. After discovering that a case had been made in court, Medvedev, who had earlier fled the Russian army and sought asylum in Norway with S, came forward to testify. Medvedev, who finally agreed to talk, said some truly chilling things in the first place. Medvedev stated that Russia's claims of accidental assaults on settlements are a fabrication. In addition, he claimed that Russia freaked out when Ukraine gained ground on Russia in the conflict, and that Putin is trying to scare Ukraine with these actions. He stated that Putin personally gave the order for missiles to be fired at civilian communities. Medvedev added that the same standards applied to Russian citizens. According to the Russian commander, the Ukrainian army's progress has been slowed because of the deployment of conscripts. What he meant was that these troops were murdered in broad daylight. Furthermore, these civilians are not provided with military training. The mere confirmation of the veracity of these allegations has caused the entire world to stand up and take notice. The Russian army's approach toward mental health issues was revealed in astonishing detail by a commander who revealed a wealth of insider information. The commander claimed that his superiors could use any means necessary to stop deserting soldiers. Not only did they have the ability to murder, but they also had an endless amount of force. Putin had given orders for the commanders to open fire on any soldier who attempted to flee the outposts. Human rights abuses led to the deaths of soldiers who were already fighting with starvation and disease. These people who were slain while trying to flee have been listed as missing. These were individuals whose loved ones were in the dark about their passing. Soldiers were escaping from the outposts, risking death in order to avoid being captured by the Ukrainian army. Despite being listed as missing, viewed as traitors by the Russian army, however, it has come to light that the people living in these areas of Ukraine's land were Russia's primary target when it launched its airstrikes. There, people were kidnapped from the area and transferred to Russia after chaos spread there. Since Ukrainian citizens were not given a say in the matter, it was agreed that international law should see this as a case of human abduction. The world saw that Ukrainian nationals were actively working to destroy not only their country, but also their very national identity. Following this, an arrest warrant was issued for Russian President Vladimir Putin on charges of a wide range of criminal offenses. Putin, however, stated that he did not accept the ruling in any way and would not abide by the international court's ruling. The Kremlin later declared that Russian President Vladimir Putin was innocent and that it would not acknowledge the verdict. It was also highlighted that nothing that took place could be considered a war crime because it was all inevitable and unavoidable due to the nature of conflict. The valiant Ukrainian army has received continued assistance from several countries. Putin's fury is growing by the day, and he is continuously threatening European countries, despite the fact that all countries are sending as much aid as they can. Putin's actions have only served to increase tensions as the West continues its relentless assault. It has repeatedly assured Ukraine that it will do everything in its power to help it win the conflict. This ensures that Ukrainian troops always have access to cutting-edge equipment during operations. Russia is quite concerned about the availability of sophisticated weapons for the Ukrainian army. More than half of the Russian army's resources have been depleted, and they are having trouble keeping up with ammunition demands. On the other side, the Russian soldiers' fears are justified given the almost limitless strength of the Ukrainian army. Not only has the sight been kind to Ukrainians, but so have many other countries. These nations have openly welcomed refugees from other countries and are providing them with every possible resource. Some nations send combat soldiers to Ukraine in order to train local forces and instruct new recruits in the proper use of the military hardware they have provided. Ukrainian soldiers bolster the strength of their forces. While it is common knowledge that Russia sends its soldiers to the front lines with only a few days of training and no prior experience, it is also common knowledge that large sums of money are currently flowing into Ukraine. Ukraine is quite upfront about all developments, documenting all aid given to the board. Despite this, Russia refuses to disclose its damage statistics. Putin either avoided discussing the country supporting its position or did so cautiously. He was concerned that hostile countries might enhance their support for Ukraine if it became known that help was also coming to Russia. Since Iran, formerly one of Russia's major backers, has turned its back on Putin, it appears that Russia will no longer be able to conceal the aid. The International Court's verdict of guilt implicates Vladimir Putin in a wide range of wrongdoings. Since the start of the war, Iran has been under intense pressure from European countries, making it impossible for Tehran to provide any additional support for Putin. It is unclear how Russia intends to proceed with the conflict now that Iran is no longer on its side. Putin, infuriated by even the smallest show of sympathy for Ukraine, has made repeated threats against these countries. However, it is common knowledge that few nations pay any mind to Putin's warnings anymore. British intelligence released this dossier to numerous media sites, and it has shocked the world. The fronts have become increasingly tough for the Russian military due to the accomplishments of the Ukrainian army, which has driven Putin insane. Ukrainian forces who are currently at against Russia's too do not rest while they maintain their frontline advantage. Putin pours Russia's entire budget on the military, where he has had little success. Major events have occurred in the last few days as Russia continues to try to invade Ukraine. The most important thing to note is that massive explosions have occurred in Russian territory as a result of operations organized by Ukrainian forces. The Russian armed forces and the Kremlin are understandably nervous about the possibility of a coordinated strike by Ukrainian forces on Russian soil. Russia is now in danger as it did not anticipate this type of strike. Many Russians are leaving their homes around the country. People in Russia are trying to leave the nation because, according to interviews, the war has reached their territory and they fear for their lives. After that, the Ukrainian army carried out a string of successful operations that gradually chipped away at the Russian army's primary base. The explosion in the outer quarters sparked a fire that rose several meters. The Russian invaders were unable to stave off the Ukrainian forces and were ultimately driven from the lands they had conquered at the outset of the conflict. There has been coverage of this crisis all throughout the world's media outlets. The world is shocked by the strength of the Ukrainian military. The Russian military can no longer assume that they can exit the battlefield with a triumph just because they started it. One of the major details that stood out on the global agenda that the war in Ukraine has spread further was that the Ukrainian army, which has dealt great blows to the Russian invaders in the operation organized by the Ukrainian forces, starts a new operation without wasting any time. After this, the British Ministry of Defence's assessment of the battleground specifics received widespread attention across the globe. In these final days of the battle, the Russian military has placed a far higher emphasis on their air defense systems. British intelligence's most vital finding was that Russian forces had taken into account the war's ground operations while designing their defenses. Recent actions conducted by Ukrainian forces, however, have presented significant challenges for the Russian army, which has long recognized the vital role of air defense systems but has been unable to develop them. The Russian military is still more susceptible to a deep air attack by Ukrainian forces, despite extensive research into developing air defense systems. Immediately following the Russian invasion of Ukrainian territory on February 24, when the Russian army was already struggling to deal with the crisis, the activation of the long-range Patriot missiles only made matters worse. These issues arise because Moscow is inside Patriot missile range. Recently, the Russian military has been at a loss as to how to counter the increasingly powerful Ukrainian forces. The current operation by Ukrainian forces has once again demonstrated the inadequacy of the Russian armed forces' air defense systems. The Ukrainian military launched a surprise attack on the Russian air station at Engels. The war's expansion into Russian territory has sparked widespread fear. The attack on the Engels air base was a turning point in the war against aerial assaults. This small station in the Saratov region of Russia played a crucial role for the armed forces. The strategically vital Russian air base was wiped out by the Ukrainian army. State-of-the-art drones. Russian planes failed to respond and never got airborne. 3 Russian servicemen were killed in an airstrike by Ukrainian forces during this operation. The Kremlin issued a red alarm after learning of the attack within Russia. All Russian aviation bases have had their security and air defense systems beefed up in response to a government mandate, according to the planes. All Russian aircraft were relocated to the more secure quarters, and the presence of hangars was a major source of unease for the Russian armed forces. With each incoming instruction, the Ukrainian army's activities get more impressive. The Ukrainian military has coordinated a fresh strike using unmanned aerial vehicles, while all other operations proceed at a breakneck pace. Despite lacking jets, the Ukrainian army was able to demonstrate to the world through this operation that they can establish a high priority in the airspace against the Russian army with just drums. Residents of the region in Russia where the operation took place have said that the explosions captured on camera are truly stunning. Sighing and rising fires are the result of an explosion. Ukrainian soldiers have launched an offensive, but it is unclear what will happen next. Despite Russian claims that they disabled the drone Ukraine was attempting to destroy, no obvious effects have been observed in the area where the explosions took place. Everyone in the world knows that these sources frequently lie. This is due to the fact that the Ukrainian army has successfully expelled the Russian invaders from the land. Russian sources claim that every operation has been a success, but no one has yet begun to believe them. Putin's consistent efforts to shield himself from the spotlight are a major factor in the widespread skepticism around him. The primary reason for this is its importance to Putin, who has been heavily criticized for his performance in the operations to maintain one's authority by proving one's self-righteous. While Russian news outlets are reporting this, Skeptics are waiting for official statements from the Ukrainian government. The fact that the Ukrainian military organized this operation in response to the report published by British intelligence is a contributing factor. The fact that British intelligence had predicted a strike by Ukrainian forces proved their accuracy. Since Russia's air bases can't defend themselves adequately, it seems like Ukrainian forces will launch many more attacks in the region. If Ukraine keeps up these efforts, they will inevitably win a decisive advantage. Even though the Russian military has beefed up protections at nearly all of its air bases within its borders, it is still vulnerable to Ukrainian drone attacks. A short time later, some shocking new information emerged. This report comes from a major terminal in St. Petersburg. Ukrainian soldiers reportedly employed their mountain-specific military vehicles on the water. This time, Ukrainian forces used unmanned naval vehicles and the Delta to launch a devastating attack on a Russian oil tanker docked in the port. Many Russian Navy ships were in the area and they were all rendered useless when oil tankers exploded in the harbor. Ukraine could make the most of the supplies being sent their way because the Russian military, which is fully vulnerable to bombings, appears to be in serious difficulties at sea. The use of sophisticated weaponry has been a major setback for the Russian military at every stage of the conflict. The Ukrainian army is always 10 minutes ahead of the Russian army's start time. Ukrainian troops' modern weapons have been successful in deterring Russian forces. Attempts to organize strikes using weapons from the Soviet Union era. The Russian invaders, having been driven back from many fronts, began defecting from the ranks of the army. The military has also felt the effects of Putin's hard approach. Conflict experts predict that Russia will collapse completely if the Russian army, which is short on military troops, continues to fail at practically all of its operations, despite international pleas for him to cease. Putin keeps trying to invade Ukraine. The incredibly helpful button is down below. The action taken by Ukraine is terrible. The Russian military's attempts to defeat Ukraine were futile. Russian troops displayed a white flag of surrender. Ukrainian troops have now surrounded Russia. Thanks to this advantage, there has been a dramatic shift in the status of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian hegemony in the region has been solidified with this attack on the Zaporizhzhia headquarters. The Ukrainian army has been gaining ground steadily in the final days of the fight against Russia. If things keep going the way they have, the Russian army will be completely taken aback by its string of losses. The Ukrainian army is making progress and will soon be able to put an end to the conflict. Putin does not know what to do in the face of the desperation of the Russian military. Many of Zaporizhzhia's previous difficulties have recently reappeared. The plight of the Russian armed forces has been repeated in countries all around the globe. Ukraine's intelligence network has been put to use in new ways recently. The Russian military initiated action against Ukraine without having all the information it needed. Russia's armed forces, though, are hesitant to do so. The disarray within the Russian army has made it hard to win even a minor battle against the Ukrainian military. Things will change drastically in the long run, however. The Russian military would suffer its greatest ever defeat because of the vital intelligence obtained by the Ukrainians. Ukrainian intelligence initially dispatched directors to discover one of Russia's major military bases in the region. The director uses sonar to scan this area. The Ukrainian army maps the entire territory after these scans against the Russian army. A huge number of unmanned aerial vehicles and Ukrainian special forces were recruited to conduct an operation against the military facility in this region, which is critical for Zaporizhzhia control. At the same time, Ukrainian troops were making preparations for a significant step, knowing the importance of this attack order. They captured a number of tanks. However, these actions have fully encircled the Russian troops. Ukrainian troops began to advance on Zaporizhzhia. The Russian army is surrounded because Ukraine controls every inch of territory. While a huge number of Ukrainian soldiers approached the Russian military headquarters in this location, the Russian observation unit began to make several movements when they detected the Ukrainian army. The Russian army was prepared for such a raid on the headquarters this time because the Ukrainian army was aware of this strategy. It made the move to corner the Russian force, which undoubtedly dealt a crushing blow to the Russian army. The Bayraktars, who had been taken from the airport by Ukrainian soldiers, began blasting the Russian military buildings one after the other. The Ukrainian army also started a ground offensive, but because it was separated along the road, part of its forces were placed behind the corridors. The Russian army was unaware of this maneuver. Ukrainian soldiers began to alert the Russian military command. The Russians then demonstrated their refusal to surrender by starting fire. The Ukrainian army then brought the HIMARS closer to this region in order to bring it into range with the tanks already nearby. The Ukrainian soldiers' speed hastened when the tanks began firing one after the other. The Russian headquarters outside walls were severely damaged. The Ukrainian Abrams were especially effective at this moment because of their uranium-fortified barrels. The Ukrainian army opened fire, leveling the headquarters. The Ukrainian army then began to send infantry battalions against the Russian army while Russian soldiers were rendered powerless. They began to shelter within the headquarters since they were unable to withstand the strength of the tanks despite exchanging bullets. Then Ukraine's final decisive move changed everything. Ukraine declared capitulation after completely encircling the HQ. Thousands of troops moved to surrender to the Ukrainian army at the same time when the rest of the Russian troops opened fire. The Ukrainian army drew the Bayraktars back to this region and began shelling. Simultaneously, the Russian army opted to surrender by hoisting the white flag they had constructed from the sheets they had on hand at their headquarters. Following that, the confessions of the captive Russian soldiers drove Putin insane. Many captured Russians reported that life in Zaporizhzhia was terrible for them. Following that, alarming revelations about the Russian army began to surface. The captured Russian soldier highlighted that Putin has recently been unable to deploy soldiers to this region, citing logistics as the primary reason. As the Ukrainian army attacked this territory one after another, the supply network was completely cut off. However, the actions Ukrainian soldiers took here were constantly geared toward the Russian army. Putin was continually blaming Russia's army for failing initiatives and bad policies. As a result, the Russian army's problems escalated to the point that it was unsure what to do when the Russian soldiers chose to revolt against their previous commander. Everything changed. Putin has been fighting two different enemies for some time because the Ukrainian army was aware of the two distinct targets. They proceeded with caution. While Putin's initial adversary was the Ukrainian army, another adversary was identified as Putin's opponents within the Russian army. Putin's continuous clashes with these opposition groups created the groundwork for the Russian army to reach a crisis point. The Ukrainian army then understood it had thrown Russia into a major crisis. If the current situation continues, there will be tremendous popular mobilization and a genuine coup attempt in Russia. With the current state of affairs, Putin's demise is expected to occur quickly, but a vital observation made by war analysts has changed everything. According to military specialists, Putin's time and power are running out. Putin, on the other hand, has no chance of escaping if he stays as he is. Putin will face a serious trial when his leadership comes to an end in the near future. His misdeeds, as well as his numerous war crimes, will change everything. However, many officials who are scared of Putin's trial have begun to emerge. All individuals deemed accountable for the Russian army's problems in this region were exonerated solely because they were close to Putin. Although everyone knew that this closeness to Putin would produce problems in the long run, Russia's policies have become increasingly problematic, are the source of great stress, and with the breach of numerous international laws, the Russian army is at a loss for what to do. If this trend continues, the Ukrainian army will win the conflict and Ukraine's regional dominance will grow while Russia will have little effect. It is believed that the Russians are aware of this. If Putin loses the conflict, Russia's activities in the region will be over. Russia will no longer have any edge, and several of its satellite countries will begin to speak out against Putin. And if Putin's problems worsen, Russia will be unable to accomplish even the smallest advance. This means that numerous balances in Eastern Europe will shift and the Russian army will suffer as a result. Tensions in the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Arctic, and Atlantic Oceans continue to rise under the shadow of Ukraine's conflict. US commanders and military observers are concerned about Russia's submarine fleet's activity thousands of miles off the U.S. coast. At the same time, U.S. Coastal Security has issued a warning about Russian warships and surveillance ships that have recently appeared off the coasts of Washington and Hawaii. There is no border infringement in the Atlantic, nor is there any serious intent to establish a mutually hostile environment. However, given the current scenario, the Russian Navy's activities less than 1,000 miles from the U.S. coast are enough to put the U.S. Navy on high alert for coastal security. Consider the U.S. Navy's attitude toward Russian Navy submarines and warships, as well as the Russian Navy's activity near the U.S. coast. We endeavor to deliver you the most striking news as soon as feasible as divine justice. You can help us by subscribing to our channel. We work hard day and night with our skilled staff. Russian Navy forces have accumulated in the Black Sea throughout the war, which began with Putin's full-scale invasion of neighboring Ukraine in February. Russian submarines are also becoming more visible off the coast of the United States and in the Mediterranean, according to officials. The Russian Navy commands one of the world's most diversified submarine fleets. Some can carry nuclear-capable ballistic missiles, which Moscow deems critical to its strategic deterrence. As a result, the increase observed in the United States and along the Mediterranean coast is critical. Russia has been attempting to build its submarine fleet since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Moscow has developed a fleet of submarines capable of targeting the most crucial sites in the United States and continental Europe, particularly in recent years. Putin declared in this regard that his country will develop more nuclear-powered submarines to secure Russia's security for decades to come. There are reports of nuclear submarines being deployed off the coast of the United States as well as elsewhere in the Mediterranean and around Europe. According to Michael Peterson, the head of the Russian Institute for Maritime Studies, which conducts research on the Russian military, these Russian deployments, as Peterson stated, are evocative of Cold War-era Soviet submarines. On the other hand, U.S. Northern Command and NORAD's U.S. Air Force First General Glenn Van Herk warned about the growing presence of nuclear-powered Vince-class submarines off the U.S. shores. Russia, according to Van Herk, is the country's main threat right now. The Russians, according to Van Herk, first moved the severed Minsk submarines to the Pacific. Another submarine is currently in the Mediterranean while another is on its way to the Atlantic. This might be a constant near threat, carrying huge numbers of ground attack cruise missiles that could threaten the U.S. in 2021, which would then hurt compared to domestic submarines in terms of stealth. As a result, NorCO believes that the issue should be avoided as soon as possible so that the Russians do not operate silently in the waters. Navy Vice Admiral Andrew Woody Lewis told the U.S. Naval Institute and the Center for Strategic and International Studies that the increased presence of Russian submarine activities in the Atlantic Ocean means his military no longer considers the East Coast. We've witnessed an increase in the number of Russian submarines deployed in the Atlantic, and they're more capable to stay in the water longer and have more lethal missile systems than ever before. The United States Navy is also not to be overlooked. Furthermore, the U.S. Navy is also undergoing modernization. The U.S. fleet consists of 64 submarines, 50 of which are nuclear-powered attack submarines. According to the nonprofit Nuclear Threat Initiative, Their job is to support ground operations and carrier groups while also conducting surveillance. Furthermore, construction in the United States began in June 2022. The U.S. Navy is expected to deploy 3 of the country's most powerful attack submarines, including the new Spin, the largest and most advanced Columbia-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. The United States Navy has deployed the most classified U.S. submarine, the Ohio class, to the Arabian Sea. Russia, on the other side, did not hesitate to respond with the Admiral Gorshkov frigate. The Russian frigate, Admiral Gorshkov, armed with Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles, has been sighted headed towards Washington. It is essentially the first vessel refitted to use Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles. According to open-source data, it is now alleged that the Russian vessel has already traversed half of the Atlantic Ocean, which has Washington concerned, given that the launch range of Zircon missiles can reach 2,000 kilometers. During its inaugural trip, the Admiral Gorshkov guided missile frigate was closely monitored by NATO naval forces. This observation took place after the Royal Navy intercepted Gorshkov and his Navy force as they crossed the English Channel earlier this month. The Russian ship was recently followed by the Portuguese Navy in the Atlantic and was expected to surround Africa. But radar surveillance sites indicate Admiral Gorshkov made an unexpected move. According to a persuasive source on the issue, the Russian frigate has abandoned the escorting tanker in the Bay of Biscay and is heading west. There has been no official word from the Russian Ministry of Defense on this topic. But if the reports of British journalists are true, the Russian ship may approach Washington within striking distance of hypersonic missiles in the coming days. The U.S. Coast Guard said it was watching a suspected Russian espionage ship in international waters off the coast of Hawaii as tensions between Washington and Moscow remain high due to Russia's war in Ukraine. The Coast Guard said the situation is not exceptional, but it is being constantly observed. According to the U.S. Coast Guard statement, foreign military vessels might freely transit through the exclusive economic zone of the United States. According to international customary law, foreign-flagged military vessels were operating and traveling within the intervention area of Coast Guard Zone 14. This was not the first time Russian spy ships were discovered off the coast of the United States. US officials identified a Russian spy ship near the southeast coast of the U.S. in 2019, and this Russian ship was observed traveling on an unsafe course. The actions of this Russian spy and surveillance ship, the Viktor Lenov, which was cruising off the coasts of South Carolina and Florida, was ruled unsafe because it did not utilize flashing lights in low visibility conditions and did not reply to merchant ship attempts to communicate with it in order to avoid it. Following the discovery of this Russian ship, the USCG stated in a statement that it will continue to communicate with DoD partners, give updates on foreign ship movements and activities, and meet availability in accordance with international maritime rules. The danger of Russian spy ships in the waters persisted after the USCG pronouncements, but the U.S. did not turn a blind eye to the Russians on this matter. Another Russian espionage ship was spotted along the Hawaiian coast by the U.S. Coast Guard. According to the U.S. Coast Guard footage, the ship was identified as the Vishnya-class intelligence ship Karelia. Satellite images show the Russian ship nearing the Hawaiian coast at a distance of 40 kilometers, about 25 miles. At a press briefing, Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh stated that the Coast Guard is still monitoring the ship. The Pentagon had no idea why the Russians were putting the ship so close to Hawaii. But Singh said it was extremely risky for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to investigate this problem. The unit is collaborating with the Department of Defense to monitor ship movements and, if necessary, give an increased U.S. presence in a region where a foreign military vessel may be passing through. On the other hand, Russian intelligence ships have previously cruised near Hawaii, and the Coast Guard will follow Karelia. In May 2021, The ship was cruising in international waters at the time and was not dangerous to navigation. However, with the current increase in tension danger in the oceans, the situation has begun to shift dramatically. Only the United States and its allies are expected to take bold action against Russia's potentially dangerous moves, according to experts on the subject. The United States and its allies should increase their actions in the high north to dissuade China and Russia. He acknowledged that the physical presence of allied navies and coast guards is becoming increasingly important as Russia strengthens its military presence and China expands its intentions beyond trade in high northern waters. In agreement with senior naval officers from the three countries and a National Security Council official, these steps should be implemented as soon as feasible for safer maritime borders, and Russian expansionist actions in the seas should be avoided.